On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched massive attacks against Iran. They killed its supreme leader, they bombed its nuclear facilities, and in Washington, they declared it a victory. But there's something the mainstream media isn't telling you. While the United States was attacking Iran, the price of Brent crude oil soared to around $120 a barrel, and that extra money went directly to bail out Russia's war budget. That's not a minor detail. That's the most brutal irony of modern geopolitics. Because Russia isn't sending military divisions to help Iran, it's doing something more lasting. It's teaching it how to see the battlefield, with satellites, with intelligence, with precise coordinates of where American warships and aircraft are. And China, for its part, is using this conflict as a real-time laboratory to study the United States military capabilities and refine its own doctrine for future conflicts in the Indo-Pacific. Think about it. While America fights in the Middle East, its two main rivals are taking notes, building alliances, and drawing up the map of the New World Order. The strategy that Nixon and Kissinger built over decades, keeping Russia and China apart, is crumbling before our eyes. This isn't a regional war. This is the beginning of something much bigger. And I want you to hold on to that image for a moment. Not the explosion, not the flames, but the numbers. Because in economics, the numbers tell you the truth when politicians are lying to you. Brent crude reached $126 a barrel in mid-March 2026. WTI surpassed $98. The International Energy Agency described this as the greatest energy and food security challenge in the history of the world. That's not rhetoric. That's what happens when you close the Strait of Hormuz, which is exactly what Iran did. And what very few people in the United States are still understanding is this. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened within a system of alliances, within a logic of power, within a war much larger than the one they're showing you on television. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Russia. Let's talk about China. Let's talk about what it really means that two nuclear powers, the most serious rivals the United States has had since World War II, are actively supporting Iran in this conflict. Because when you say Russia and China are backing Iran, it sounds like a newspaper headline. But when you start to understand the mechanism, when you start to understand the details of how that support works, you realize that we're talking about something that's going to change the world as we know it. Let's start with Russia. Because people have this idea that Russia is busy in Ukraine and doesn't have the time or resources to get involved in another war. And that's true, but it's only half the story. Military cooperation between Russia and Iran intensified during the conflict in Ukraine, with Tehran supplying drones and missiles to Moscow in exchange for advanced systems like S-400 air defenses. Do you understand what that means? Russia and Iran had already been doing each other favors for years. They had already built a real concrete military exchange relationship with hardware that works on real battlefields. So when the bombing started on February 28, 2026, Russia didn't have to improvise anything. The infrastructure for cooperation was already in place. So what exactly did Russia do? Because this is what people need to understand. Russia's role in this war focused on intelligence sharing and logistical support, avoiding direct combat so as not to strain its resources amid the conflict in Ukraine. US officials reported that Moscow supplied Iran with real-time data on the positions of American warships and aircraft, enabling more precise retaliatory strikes. This assistance included satellite feeds of Russian assets, which helped Iran monitor US movements in the Middle East. Think about that. Not troops, not infantry divisions crossing the border, something far more sophisticated and far harder to combat: information, coordinates, the lifeblood of modern warfare. As former CIA officer Bruce Riedel once observed, in modern warfare, coordinates are often worth more than bullets. Whoever knows where the enemy is, wins. That axiom is playing out in real time in the Persian Gulf, and Russia is handing it to Iran. The Canopus V satellite, which was redesignated Kayam when transferred to Iranian operational use, provides Tehran with 24/7 optical and radar imagery. Iran on its own does not have the satellite constellation to track naval assets at sea. Russia does. And that difference, that technological gap that Russia is closing for Iran, is what explains something that has astonished many military analysts: the precision of Iranian attacks. The drone that struck a US military installation in Kuwait, killing 6 American soldiers, didn't find its target by accident. Pentagon officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, noted that several recent Iranian attacks hit installations directly associated with US operations, targets whose coordinates don't appear on any public map. That's Russian intelligence working in real time. That's the difference between a missile landing in the desert and a missile coming in through the right window. And then there's China's role, which is different from Russia's, but equally devastating to American strategy. China has not sent troops. China has not sent warships. China has maintained a posture of containment, emphasizing diplomacy while providing indirect support to Iran. Intelligence assessments indicated that Beijing prepared to offer financial aid and missile components, though it refrained from overt military involvement to safeguard its oil imports through the disputed waters. But that indirect support is not minor. It is strategic, it is long-term. And it was built up over years before this conflict began. Over the past decade, China and Iran have intensified their cooperation in missile technology development, satellite and space initiatives, intelligence sharing, cybersecurity, and electronic warfare. That's a decade of preparation, a decade of technology transfer, and now that investment is paying off on the battlefield. The YLC-8B radar, a UHF band system supplied by China, uses low-frequency waves designed to reduce the effectiveness of radar-absorbing coatings on U.S. stealth aircraft. The B-21 radar and the F-35C were designed to be invisible. Against a YLC-8B, they are considerably less invisible. That changes the balance of power in the air, which is where the United States thought it had an absolute advantage. And there's more. China has spent years reshaping Iran's electronic warfare landscape, exporting advanced radar systems, transitioning Iranian military navigation from the US GPS to China's encrypted Beidou 3 constellation, and using its expanding satellite network to support signals intelligence and terrain mapping for Iranian forces. It understands what that means. Iran no longer relies on the US GPS to guide its missiles. It uses the Chinese Beidou. And if the US decides to interfere with that system, interfering with the Chinese GPS would be an act of war against China directly. It's a perfect shield. China has given Iran the ability to operate within a system that Washington cannot touch without escalating the conflict to a completely different level. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz comes in, because I want you to understand what's really at stake there. It's not just Iranian oil. It's not just the war between Israel and Tehran. The Strait of Hormuz is a critical transit point for global energy trade. Fuel tankers and liquefied natural gas carriers transporting around 20 million barrels of oil a day pass through it, representing roughly 20% of the world's maritime oil trade. When Iran closed that strait, it didn't cut off the United States. The United States no longer relies on oil from the Persian Gulf in the same way it once did. It cut off China, India, Japan, South Korea, the entire world. Most of the crude oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea accounting for almost 70% of shipments. Now think about that as an economist, not a military analyst. If you close the Strait of Hormuz and hurt China, why would China help you? That's the paradox. That's the internal tension within this alliance between Russia, China, and Iran that the American media isn't explaining. Because China has a huge interest in keeping the oil flowing, Beijing's priority right now is surviving the Trump presidency without a major trade war or further escalation. Of course, China will also quietly seek to solidify its advantage when it comes to rare earth metal mining. China is playing a three-dimensional chess game simultaneously. It supports Iran enough to weaken the United States in the Middle East, but not enough to cause a complete cutoff of the oil it needs to keep its economy running. It's a deliberately calculated balance, and Russia is doing the same. Moscow seems to be prioritizing US mediation in the conflict with Ukraine and has taken a similar approach in criticizing US actions in places like Venezuela after the military attack and arrest of President Nicolas Maduro in January. In other words, Russia is saying, I condemn the attack on Iran, but I'm not going to die for Iran either. And that needs to be understood within a pragmatic framework. Russia wants Iran to cause problems for the United States, but Russia also needs to negotiate in Ukraine, so it gives Iran exactly what it needs to bleed Washington dry without becoming the target of direct American retaliation itself. And while all this is happening, the money keeps flowing, because the economy doesn't stop. The conflict caused immediate volatility in energy markets, with Brent crude prices soaring 10 to 13% to around $80 to $82 a barrel by March 2nd, 2026. And then it kept climbing. $200, $220, $226 is at its peak. The IEA characterized the situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, with flows through the Strait of Hormuz collapsing from 20 million barrels per day to a trickle and Gulf production cuts of at least 10 million barrels per day. And you know who got extra cash? Russia, because every barrel of Russian oil it sells to the world is worth more when Gulf oil isn't coming in. It's the height of geopolitical irony. The United States bombs Iran and ends up inadvertently funding its main adversary's war budget in Ukraine. there's something else you need to know. A Financial Times investigation found that 580 million in bets on falling oil prices were placed on the stock market by selling futures contracts just 15 minutes before Donald Trump released his statement postponing attacks on Iran until March 23, 2026, which caused oil prices to temporarily plummet. This led to speculation about insider trading and calls for a more thorough investigation. $580 million, 15 minutes before, on the futures market. Someone knew, someone always knows, and that someone made money while the world burned. That's capitalism at its purest, my friend. Don't forget that when they talk to you about democracy and freedom as if they come without a price. Now let's talk about what this means for US strategy, because here's the real issue. The issue isn't whether the United States can destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. Technically, it can. It already has, in part. The issue is what happens next, and what happens next is exactly what we're seeing now. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov condemned the US and Israeli attacks as a reckless step and a deliberate, premeditated, and unjustified act of armed aggression, accusing them of pushing the region toward a humanitarian, economic, and potentially even radiological disaster. That's not just rhetoric. It's the language used in the UN Security Council to build a case for international legitimacy. China and Russia are exploiting this conflict to position themselves as the guardians of the international order that Washington breaks when it suits them, and that positioning has real consequences. Joint military exercises involving China, Iran, and Russia in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman since 2019 have underscored a growing degree of strategic coordination. These exercises indicate a mutual interest in challenging Western naval supremacy while facilitating operational learning and technological exchange. Since 2019, they've been practicing for 7 years. They've been learning to operate together, to share frequencies, to coordinate at sea. And when war came, that practice paid off. It wasn't improvisation. It was the result of years of systematic preparation. And China has a very specific reason for learning from all of this. From China's perspective, collaboration with Iran presents an opportunity to monitor and assess Western military capabilities in real-world operational contexts. Conflicts involving Iran and its regional adversaries allow Chinese strategists to gather critical intelligence on the effectiveness of US missile defense systems, stealth aircraft, precision strike capabilities, and electronic warfare operations. Repeat that in your head. China is using Iran as a laboratory. It's watching how American weapon systems respond. It's taking notes on what works and what doesn't against the F-35, the B-21, and the aircraft carriers Abraham Lincoln and Gerald R. Ford, and it will use those notes when the time comes to confront the United States over Taiwan. That's what's happening at the deepest level of this war. It's not just Iran versus the United States. It's the dress rehearsal for the coming conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And while Washington is distracted in the Persian Gulf, Beijing is studying, learning, and refining its military doctrine for the next chapter. Moscow bought more than $4 billion worth of weapon systems from Tehran, primarily Shahed suicide drones. In return, Russia sold Iran training aircraft, attack helicopters, armored vehicles, and rifles. This isn't a charity relationship, it's a sophisticated, transactional relationship based on concrete mutual interests. Russia needed drones for Ukraine, Iran needed advanced weapon systems. They traded, and now that network of exchange is operating in real time against American troops in the Gulf. Now, I want to talk about the impact on the lives of ordinary people, because when economists and military analysts talk about these things, they sometimes forget that there are millions of people who simply go to work, pay their bills, and fill up their gas tanks. And what's happening now directly affects them. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is expected to raise the average price of WTI crude oil to $98 a barrel and reduce global GDP growth by 2.9 percentage points, annualized in the second quarter of 2026. That's not an abstract number, that's less economic growth, that's more inflation, that's more expensive to fill up your tank, that's more expensive to heat your home. That's what happens to the wallet of a working family when two military powers are facing off 8,000 miles apart. Energy-intensive industries such as petrochemicals, fertilizers, aluminum, steel, and cement will likely face the most immediate pressure as raw material and fuel costs rise sharply. More expensive fertilizers, that means more expensive food, more expensive steel, that means more expensive houses, more expensive aluminum, that means everything is more expensive from cars to airplanes. The war in the Persian Gulf doesn't stay in the Persian Gulf, it crosses the ocean, it reaches the supermarket, it reaches the gas pump. And the people who feel it most are the people who can least afford it. And then there are the US allies who are saying one thing in public and another in private. Spain declared that the US-Israeli war against Iran is a huge mistake that has only fueled a conflict unrelated to Europe and is dragging the Eastern Mediterranean region into instability. Spain permanently withdrew its ambassador from Israel. France called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. The Polish foreign minister said he had not witnessed a direct threat to Europe, the US, or Israel from Iran before the American and Israeli attacks. The Polish minister, whose country is part of NATO, an alliance supposedly on Washington's side, publicly states that he saw no direct threat before the attacks. That should make us think very seriously about the foundations of this war. Because this is the question a political economist must always ask: who benefits? Who does this serve? And when you look at the numbers honestly, when you set aside the rhetoric about democracy, the axis of evil, and national security, those who are winning in this conflict are precisely those supposedly the villains of the story. The conflict tested the durability of the axis between the three nations, revealing the pragmatic limits of their cooperation. To mitigate the energy shock caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. Treasury Department granted India a temporary 30-day emergency waiver on March 6, 2026, authorizing the purchase of stranded Russian oil shipments to stabilize domestic fuel prices. Did you catch that? The United States authorized India to buy Russian oil to stabilize its own prices, the same Russian oil that Washington has been trying to sanction for years. The same Russia that is supposed to be the enemy. The real world is not divided into good and bad with the clarity with which it is presented on the evening news. And let's get back to the fundamentals, because everything we've been analyzing, Russian satellite intelligence, Chinese radars, the closure of the strait, oil prices, drifting allies, all of this leads us to a central question. The most important of all, does the United States have a strategy that works for this new world? And I think the honest answer is that the strategy that worked for 50 years no longer works. The Nixon-Kissinger strategy was to keep Russia and China separate. It worked for decades, but now those two powers are acting together with a level of coordination that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the two countries have exchanged numerous high-level official visits, signed a strategic partnership agreement, and strengthened their military ties, and they have incorporated Iran into that system. Coordination became easier after Iran joined the international clubs led by Moscow and Beijing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2023, and the BRICS group of developing nations the following year. A new architecture of international power is being built, and it is being deliberately constructed as an alternative to the order that Washington designed after World War II. I'm not saying that order was perfect, it wasn't. It was full of illegal interventions, wars that shouldn't have been fought, and governments overthrown by corporate interests disguised as democratic ones. But what's coming now isn't necessarily better for ordinary people around the world either. It's simply different. It's a multipolar world where no single power can completely impose its will, and that has advantages. But it also has enormous dangers, because when great powers divide the world into spheres of influence without any global authority to restrain them, it's civilian populations who pay the price. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi also addressed the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. According to Politico, the Iranian minister said that Tehran has imposed selective restrictions on ships belonging to countries it considers hostile. The strait is not closed. It is closed only to American and Israeli ships and tankers, not to others. That is geopolitics in action. Iran is differentiating. It is not closing the strait to everyone. It is strategically closing it to those it considers its enemies while maintaining the flow for its allies, for China, for India, for Turkey. It is building a map of friends and enemies in real time in the midst of a war, and that map is exactly the map of the new world order that is emerging. And I want to conclude this part of the analysis with something I believe is fundamental. Because there's a very human, very understandable tendency to see these conflicts as something that happens to other people in faraway places, as something you see on the news but that doesn't affect you. But when the price of gasoline rises, when inflation eats away at your salary, when interest rates rise because the central bank has to respond to the energy shock, that conflict has already arrived at your doorstep, it's already on your dinner table, it's already in your pocket. Unlike sanctions-driven disruptions, a sustained blockade of the Strait of Hormuz obstructs not only trade routes but also producers' ability to export, pushing markets beyond adjustment mechanisms toward forced demand destruction and structural reconfiguration. Forced demand destruction. That means people stop buying, That means businesses close, that means recession, and recessions aren't felt by those with diversified portfolios and offshore accounts. They're felt by workers, they're felt by families, they're felt by those who live paycheck to paycheck. So when someone asks you what Russia or China or Iran has to do with you, you have the answer. It has to do with the price of your gas, with the price of your food, with whether your company is going to lay off staff in the coming months, with whether the bank is going to raise your mortgage rate. The global economy is connected in ways that politicians prefer not to explain, because if people understood those connections, they would ask very uncomfortable questions about why certain decisions are made, who makes them, and who they actually benefit. We continue to ask ourselves those questions, because that's what we have to do.